After going through this video, you will be able to explain the importance of PHP in web development, install PHP in Linux OS. Hey, so we are already halfway through our training. I hope and believe you are having fun with a lot of exciting things to learn and practice. So, buckle up because this ride is going to get more exciting and adventurous. PHP is a general purpose scripting language, especially suited for web development. Now, let's understand why PHP language is used in web development. We already know the communication channel between a browser and a web server. The browser feels the need of a service and tries to fetch a relevant web page when we type a URL in its address bar. The browser then makes a DNS lookup to find the host computer corresponding to the URL that contains the desired web page. Once the browser finds the host computer, it connects to the web server running on it so that they can communicate with each other. The browser then sends an HTTP request to the web server mentioning which web page it wants. The web server then acts on the request and finds the web page on its computer. Once the web server finds the web page, it sends it to the browser as an HTTP response. Till now, we have dealt with web pages that only contain the HTML and CSS code. But now, we will see web pages that contain PHP code that are also called PHP files. In case of PHP files, there is just one difference. When the web server receives a request for a web page, that's a PHP file. It does one thing extra. It executes the PHP code in the file and sends the output of it to the browser as a response. Unlike in case of HTML files where it doesn't even care what the file contains and sends the content of the file as it is to the browser. Also, PHP is a server-side scripting or a backend language as it gets executed on the server side. And the most important is, it helps to connect to the DBMS to store and fetch information. To understand this, let us revisit the cab service example from the previous module. Here, we have three tables. A customer table that stores the records of each customer who uses the cab rental service. A drivers table that stores the records of each driver who is registered with the cab rental company. And the rides table that stores details of each ride. But the important question here is, where does this data come from? So, every customer and driver who wants to use the services of this cab rental company has to first register themselves by filling up a form. Now, once the driver and customers submit the form, there must be a person somewhere who will manually execute SQL queries in order to insert the submitted data in a table. So here comes PHP into the picture. Whenever a new customer or a driver fills up and submits a form, a new HTTP request gets initiated, and this time for a PHP file. Also, all the data that a user enters in the form comes along with this HTTP request and is accessible in the PHP file. Now, the web server will find and execute the SQL queries in the PHP file on the appropriate database. We will learn about these in detail in later topics, but first, let us see how we can install PHP in Windows and Linux OS. For Windows OS, we don't need to install PHP as it is integrated to the XAMPP which we have already installed. For Linux, to install PHP, we first need to open the terminal. Then, we will enter this command. The PHP CLI is a simple PHP command line interface that executes standalone PHP files through the terminal, whereas libapache2-mod.php is a PHP module for Apache that tells Apache to execute the PHP file before sending the response. This is very important as if we don't install this module, Apache would treat PHP files like any other file and will send the response to the browser as it is. Now, if prompted, we will enter our login password. Next, press Y to confirm. It might take some time to complete the installation. So here we go. The PHP installation is complete in Linux OS. In the next video, we will see the basic syntax of PHP and understand a few PHP tags. After going through this video, you will be able to explain the basic syntax of a PHP code, create a PHP file, explain the importance of PHP as programming language for web development. Just like HTML, PHP files have an extension .php and they are stored inside c/zamp/htdocs. And like most other programming languages, the PHP statements end with a semicolon. Now, let us see the basic syntax to write code in PHP. To do this, we will open our VS Code editor and will write this code. You can find this code below the video. Similar to HTML code, in PHP code we have a start tag and an end tag. All the PHP code is written inside this PHP opening and closing tag. Echo is used to print any text, which in this case is hello world. Then we have a line comment. The line comments are never executed in a program and are used by the developers internally to provide some information or some comment regarding the code they write. Like in this case, this is our first PHP code. So we have added a line comment as this is my first PHP code. To add a line comment, we always have to use double forward slashes followed by the text we want to add. Next, we will save this file as hello.php inside the c/zamp/htdocs/project location folder. Now, let us open this file we just created. To open the file, we will start the XAMPP and Apache service. In our browser address bar, we will enter the default IP address followed by the name of the PHP file like this. Yes, we can see Hello World on our PHP web page. We can also check the response by viewing the page source. Here, we can see that the web server has first executed the PHP file and has then sent the output as a response. This is why PHP is a scripting language or a backend language. If you remember, in HTML, the web server directly sends the output to the browser without knowing what the file contains. Now, let us modify our code a bit. Can you guess what will be the output in this case? Pause the video for a moment and think. Well, if you thought that the output would remain unchanged, then tada! We can see that the additional lines are added in the output as it is because these lines are not written inside the PHP tags. Anything we write outside the tags is not considered to be part of the PHP code and will be ignored by the PHP interpreter. It will rather become part of the output and will be displayed as such. Let us again check the response by viewing the page source. We can see the web server executed everything that's inside the PHP tag and added everything that's outside to the response. Now, let us further modify our code. This time, let's make the text Hello World as a heading. To do this, we will add the h1 HTML tag like this. If we look at the output now, we can see Hello World as a heading. And if we look at the response, we can see h1 HTML tag. Can you guess why? This is because here the execution happens in two phases. First, the PHP code is executed by the web server. Now the output of the PHP code along with the HTML code is sent to the browser as a response. In the second phase, the browser renders the response being sent by the web server, which in this case is a HTML snippet. Now, let us come back to our code. If we observe, some of us will say that the HTML code is inside the PHP file but outside the PHP tags. And some of us will say that inside the HTML code, we have our PHP code. So, which of the scenarios is true for this code? Well, the latter is true. We write normal lengthy HTML codes for our web pages and add PHP code snippets inside of it wherever required. This means we can write PHP code inside the HTML code. Also, a PHP file can contain both PHP and HTML code as we have already seen in the hello.php file. But an HTML file cannot contain PHP code. We should always save all our files as .php because even if there is no PHP code, it gives flexibility to the developers to add PHP code in the file in the future. So, let us quickly summarize why PHP is preferred over other programming languages in web development. First, it can be easily embedded into HTML. Second, it is compatible with the Apache web server, which makes it more prominent among the web developer community. Next, PHP is an interpreted language, which means it does not need to be pre-compiled. This makes it very convenient for the web developers to make any change to already deployed code and see its effect immediately. Lastly, PHP has built-in integration with the most popular open source DBMS, MySQL. So that's all in this video. We will continue to learn more exciting things about PHP in upcoming topics. For now, next is a quiz. All the best. Hey, welcome back to another exciting video. Now that you know a bit about PHP, it is time to see how you can write and execute PHP codes on your mobile. So first things first, you need to install one more application from the Play Store in which you can write your PHP code. To do this, open the Play Store and enter PHP Editor in the application search bar. You can see numerous applications, but I have installed this application that has an elephant image. Although the rating of the app is not that good, it will do the work as it allows us to maintain folder structure. Also, it allows importing a complete project folder. If you want, you can try other applications too, but make sure that using such applications, you are able to create and manage folders such as CSS, API, IMG, includes, and JS. So let's get started with this application. Here at the top right side, we can see 3 red dots. If we click on these dots, we will see multiple options such as New, Open, Save As, and many more. Let us click New, and this will open a new file with some name. We can change the name as per your requirement after writing the code. Now, a few things to notice. This application does not have an integrated coding keyboard, so you can either install some third-party coding keyboard from the Play Store, or you can use an external keyboard that you can connect using a compatible adapter. Next, the editor does not show line numbers to the side of the code, which comes handy when the code throws an error. This helps to identify on which line the error is present. So, this is something you need to take care of on your own. Let us write some code and save it. To save the code, we have created a folder named PHP codes in the internal memory of the phone with any name you want. We will see in a moment why we have done this. Now, let us come to the second part of this video, where you will see how to execute the PHP code. To execute a PHP code, you need a web server application which you have already installed. So let us open the application. Here, before starting the web application, click on Select, which is right next to the document root. This will show 3 options: App Internal, Internal, and External. Click on Internal if you have saved the code in the internal storage of your mobile device, or select External if you have an external SD card in which you have saved the code. In our case, we have stored the code in the internal storage, so we will select Internal. Now, we will select the project folder in which we have the PHP code, that is PHP codes. Now that we have selected the folder, we will start the service. Please ignore the ads. This will show an IP in the address section. Click on it and in the browser, you can see all the PHP files that are inside this folder. Click on the file we want to execute, that is hello.php. So, this is how we can execute your PHP files using a web server. Also, now that you have started coding the PG Life web application as a part of your module assignments, you need to import all the corresponding HTML and CSS files. To do so, you can click on the import file option to import the previous written files in this project. This is something you need to take care of going forward in the JavaScript assignment also. Well, that was all in the video. See you in the next video. Bye-bye. After going through this video, you will be able to explain variables, assign a value to a variable, list down different types of values a variable can store. In this video, we will learn the basic elements of PHP like any other programming language, that is, variables and operators. Let's start with variables first. In PHP, a variable starts with a dollar symbol, followed by its name. For example, $A, $str, etc. A variable name can consist of alphanumeric characters and underscore. A variable name must start with either an alphabet or underscore. It cannot start with a number. It cannot have any special characters like hash, exclamation, hyphen, and even dollar, except for in the beginning. Lastly, variable names are case sensitive. $small a and $capital A are both different variables. Here, we have very few variables. Can you guess which are PHP variables and which are not? Remember, a variable starts with a $sign. $1 is not a variable as its name starts with a number. $ABC is a variable as it starts with an alphabet. $_1 is again a variable as it starts with an underscore. $str23 is also a variable as it is alphanumeric. $-ABC is not a variable as it has a special character. Now coming to the last option, $. Some of you might think this to be a variable as it starts with a $sign, but this is not a variable as it has again a special character $, which is not accepted. Let us now see how we can assign a value to a variable. Variables are assigned values using the equal to operator, where on the left side we have the name of the variable and on the right side it can be a value or an expression. In PHP, we can directly assign a variable with a value without having to declare it first. Like in this case, we have assigned the variable a value of 5 before declaring first that a is a variable. PHP is a loosely typed language, which means we do not need to specify the data type of variables, unlike other languages such as C and C++. Let us understand why. Here, we have defined the value of variables as 5, which is an integer, but in code, we have not specified the data type of a. If we replace the integer with a string value like hello world, the PHP will recognize it as a valid value where we have not specified any data type. In case you are wondering what a string is, it is simply a sequence of characters. We can even replace the value of a variable with a different data type. Let's say we have a variable a whose value is 5. Now here the data type is integer. But if we redefine the value of a variable as a string, the variable automatically gets converted to the correct data type. This means the value of a variable is now hello world and the data type is string. Let's now see what values a variable can store. As discussed earlier in the video, a variable can store integer and string values. An integer is a non-decimal number, whereas a string is a sequence of characters. Next, we can add a float value. A float value is a number in decimal form or in exponential form. For example, 3.14 is a float value. Then, we can have a Boolean value which can either be true or false. For example, is Delhi the capital of India? Its answer will be a Boolean value that can only be true or false. Next, we have an array which is used to store multiple values of the same data type in one variable. Example, here we have the name of the array as names, which has the values Bill, Steve, Mark and Larry. Next, we have object, which is one of the aspects of object-oriented programming or OOPS. We don't need to discuss this in detail as it is beyond the scope of this training. Lastly, we have a null value which means nothing. So this is all about variables in this video. In the next video, we will discuss operators in PHP. After going through this video, you will be able to explain operators, explain different types of operators and use them in a PHP code. In PHP or any programming language in general, to perform operations on values or variables, we use operators. To understand in simplest terms, let's say we have this expression. Here, plus is an operator. It can be minus, multiply or any other operator, which we will discuss shortly in this video. But for now, understand that this operator is used to perform some operation, that is adding the variables x and y. These variables, when being used in an expression along with the operator, are called operands. In PHP, there are 5 types of operators: arithmetic operators, assignment operators, increment-decrement operators, comparison operators, and logic or relational operators. Let us discuss the arithmetic operators first. These are simple mathematical operators like additional or plus operator, minus or subtraction operator, multiplication operator, division operator, and modulo operator. The addition operator is used to add operands. Let's say we have to add 2 numbers, 10 and 5. Here, we will use the addition operator. The subtraction operator is used to subtract operands. For example, if we need to subtract one number from another number, we use subtraction operator like this. The multiplication operator is used to multiply operands. We use this when we have to multiply two numbers together. Example 10 multiplied by 5. The division operator is used to divide operands. Example 10 divided by 5. And the modulo operator gives us the remainder when one operand is divided by the other operand. Example, when we divide 10 by 3, it gives us the remainder as 1. Next, we will discuss the assignment operator. These are used to assign values to variables. The first assignment operator we have is the equal to operator. It simply assigns the value of the operand on the right hand side to the operand on the left hand side. Let's say you define a variable a and you wish to assign its value as 15. To do this, we use the equal to operator. Next, we have plus equal to assignment operator. Let us see its examples first to understand better. This operator increases the value of the left operand by the value of the right operand. I suggest you pause the video for a moment and figure out what will be the value of a variable that will get printed. If you have calculated the value as 30, you are right. That is because first, the $a variable is assigned to the value as 15. Then, the plus equal to operator will add 15 to the existing value of $a. This means 15 will be added to 15 and 30 will be printed. This statement can also be written as a is equal to a plus 15. Similar to this operator, we have a minus equal to operator. This operator decreases the value of the left operand by the value of the right operand. This expression is also equivalent to a is equal to a minus 15. Now again, what do you think will be the new value of a variable? Well, you don't have to answer right now. You will get similar questions in the quiz. Similarly, we have multiply equal to, divide equal to, and modulo equal to assignment operators. Next, we will discuss the third type of operators, that is increment and decrement operators. Increment operator is used to increase the value of a variable by 1. To use an increment operator, we use 2 times plus sign after the variable, like in this code. Here, initially the variable a has been assigned a value of 5. But in the next line, we have to use the increment operator. This will increase the value of a variable by 1 from 5 to 6. This statement is also equivalent to this or this statement. But this statement is widely used as it is compact and easy to use. Similarly, we have decrement operators that are used to decrease the value of a variable by 1. To use a decrement operator, we use 2 times minus sign after the variable. If we check the output, the decrement operator will decrease the value of a variable by 1. Also, this statement is equal to this or this statement. But this is widely used owing to the compact and easy to use nature. Let's now discuss the fourth type of operators, that is comparison operators. They are used to compare two operands and are also called as Boolean operators, as they always return either true or false. These are of 6 types: equal to, not equal to, less than equal to, greater than, and greater than equal to. Equal to is used when we want to check if the two operands are equal or not. Let's say we are comparing two operands a and b. If they are equal, it will return true, else it will return false. Not equal to operator checks if the operands are not equal to each other. Like in this case, we are checking if the operands a and b are not equal to each other. It will return true if the operands are not equal to each other, else it will return false. Less than operator checks if the value of left operand is less than the value of the right operand. Here, if the value of a operand is less than the value of b operand, it will remain true, else it will return false. Next is less than equal to operator that checks if the left operand is less than or equal to the right operand and returns the value true or false accordingly. Here, we are checking if the value of a operand is less than equal to b operand, and it will return the value accordingly. Similarly, we have greater than and greater than equal to operators to return the values true or false accordingly. The Boolean operators are used to create conditional statements, which we will cover in the next topic. Lastly, we have logical operators. These operators are used to combine multiple Boolean expressions to get a single true or false. These combined expressions are also called Boolean expressions, which are again used to create conditional statements. We have three types of logical operators: AND, OR, and NOT. Let us understand AND operator with the help of this example. Let's say we have two expressions. In the first expression, the left operand is less than the right operand. That is, the statement is true. And in the second expression, both the operands are equal. In this case, the statement is false. In PHP, the AND operator is denoted as ampersand ampersand. So in our expression, we will change it to ampersand ampersand. So AND operator returns true if all the expressions are true, and if any of the expression is false, it returns false. In this case, the first expression is true, but the second expression is false. This means that the AND operator will return the value false. Now here is a quick question for you to solve. What do you think will be the value returned? Save your answer, as this question would be there in the quiz. Next is the OR operator. It is denoted by double pipes. This operator returns the value true if any of the expression is true. This means if at least one of all the expressions is true, the value returned would be true. If we revisit our previous example in which one of the expression, that is first expression, was true, and if we use OR operator in this case, the OR operator will return the value true. And lastly, we have NOT operator. It is denoted by an exclamation. It is a unary operand that takes only one value and reverses its Boolean value. Let's say we have this expression 5 greater than 4, in which the left operand, that is 5, is greater than the right operand 4. For this expression, the return value will be true. But if we use NOT operator, it will return the value false, because as explained earlier, NOT operator simply reverses the Boolean value. Let's try another example. We have this expression. Can you guess the return value? The answer is true. The first expression will return false, as the left operand has higher value than the right operand. The right expression is false, as both the values are equal. Since we are using OR operator and none of the values is true, so the final value this expression will return will be false. As we are using NOT operator, it will reverse the Boolean value. This means the final value this expression will yield is true. So in this video, we discussed different types of operators and their subtypes. Hope you had fun watching and learning in this video. Make sure to practice the expressions on your own and observe the output. Up next is a quiz. All the best. After going through this video, you will be able to explain different conditional statements, apply different conditional statements in a PHP code. In the previous topic, we discussed that Boolean operators are used to create conditional statements. In this video, we will discuss 4 types of conditional statements. These are if statement, if else statement, if else statement, and switch statement. Let's understand the first conditional statement with the help of this code and see how this is used. Here, we have used the conditional statement, which is followed by the Boolean expression, which is basically the if condition inside the parenthesis. Next, we have the code inside the curly brackets, which will only execute when this condition is true. And when the condition is false, then this code is ignored and the execution continues as such. So, if statements execute some code when one condition is true. The above explanation can also be represented using this flowchart. So, we have the condition here which, when true, will execute the code inside the if body, and when the condition is false, the code after the if statement will execute as such. Let us look at another example to understand the if statement. In this code, we have assigned the variable a value of 10, and below that we have used the if statement. Here we have the condition that a modulo 2 is equal to 0. This means that 10 divided by 2 should leave a remainder value as 0, which is true. Next, we have the code inside the if body, which will execute only when the condition is true. And in case the condition is false, it will execute this block of code as such. If we look at the output, we can see both the pieces of code are executed. Now, If we change the value of variable a from 10 to 11, what do you think will be the output? Since 11 modulo 2 will give a remainder as 1, this means that the if condition is false. So in the output, we will only see the thank you as the if body code is skipped. Now instead of skipping the if block code, we want to execute some other subsequent code even when the condition is false. For example, we want to print it's an odd number when the condition is false. So for such cases where we want to execute some code block when the condition is false, we use an if-else statement. Let us see how we can use the if-else statement in the code we discussed earlier. Here, after the if statement and the if body code, we will write the else statement followed by the else body code like this. So, when we execute this, the first step will be to check whether the if statement is true or false. In case the if statement is true, then the else statement code block will be ignored and it will directly jump to this code block. And in case the if statement is false, then the else statement gets executed followed by this code block. In the output, we can see the else statement is printed as the condition is false along with the code block after the if-else statement. Just like if-else statements can also be represented using a flowchart. When the condition is true, the code inside the if body will be executed. And when the condition is false, the code inside the else body is executed. Now we can have such cases also where we have more than two conditions like a report card, where a student is assigned some grade based on the marks the student has scored. In such cases, do you think the if and if-else statement will work? No, right? To deal with such cases where we have more than two conditions, we use the if-else statement. Let us see how we can use this statement using the report card example in this code. Here we have a marks variable to which we have assigned a value 65. Then we have the if condition that if the marks of the student is more than 90, the code will execute and will print excellent. Next we have else if statements which will print different grades based on the conditions associated with them. The else if statements are followed by the else statement. And lastly, we have this code block which will be definitely executed and is independent of the conditional statements used in the code. If we execute the code, we will get the output grade as C followed by the thank you note. Let us understand the logic behind this code. So, when the code is executed, it will first check for the if condition whether it is true or not. Here, the marks of the student is 65, which means the if condition is false and the if body code will be ignored. Next, we will move to the else if condition, which is again false and will be ignored. Similarly, the steps will continue until one of the else if statements is either true or all of them are false. In this case, this else if statement turns out to be true as the marks are more than 60 and less than 70, which means grade C value will be executed and all the remaining code will be ignored, including the else body code. If else statement can be represented using this flowchart. So what happens in case of the if else statement? We have multiple conditions. When a particular condition is true, then the code block associated with it gets executed and all other conditions and their respective code blocks are ignored. So, when the first condition is false, the code moves to the next condition and checks whether the value is true or false. No matter how many conditions we have in the code, the execution will happen like this, line by line. Now, coming to the last conditional statement of this topic, that is switch statement. Switch statements are like special if else statements. It looks more organized but has very limited use cases. Like the if else statement, the switch statement is also used to select one out of multiple blocks of code associated with different conditions. But the switch case works only when the expression matches the exact set of values and not on ranges. This limits the use of switch statement. Let us see how a switch statement is used in a code. Here, we have two variables defined a and b with the values 20 and 10 respectively. We also have a variable operator which stores what operation is to be performed on a and b. Next, we have a switch statement that takes a variable and checks its value. We don't have to use any Boolean expression for the conditions. The switch case automatically equates the variable with the case values. Based on the values we are expecting, we put different cases. And Depending on which case value the expression matches with, the corresponding code block gets executed. If the expression does not match with any of the case values provided, then this default code block gets executed. Unlike if-else statements, switch statements don't skip other blocks of code by itself. It has a tendency to execute all blocks of code even if it matches the first case value. So, to ensure that no other block of code is executed once the case values are matched, we have to explicitly add a break at the end of each code block. In our code, the operator value matches this case value and will show us the output as 200 along with the text "Thank you." Now, as an exercise, pause the video here and think about what would be the flow chart for this code that uses the switch conditional statement. Hint: the flow chart will be similar to the flow chart used for the if conditional statement. That was all about conditional statements. Up next is a quiz. All the best. After going through this video, you will be able to explain loops, list down different types of loops, apply while loop in a PHP code, explain how break and continue keywords are used in a loop. Suppose a person is working as a packaging controller at a company. The job of this person is to give command to a robot to pack the product in cartons. There are 20 cartons and inside one carton only 4 products can be placed. Now, every time a robot places a product inside a carton, the robot will again come to the person and will wait for further instructions. That is, to again pick the product and place it inside a carton. This means that the controller has to give commands 20 into 4, that is 80 times manually, to the robot to place all the products in all the cartons. This is going to be a tiring process. Obviously not for the robot because it runs on batteries. So instead of entering the commands manually, the controller creates a program that allows the robots to place the products inside all the cartons without asking the controller every time. And once all the products are placed, the robot will await for the next instructions. In PHP, we have a similar concept of loops where we can run a block of code multiple times under certain conditions. The benefit of using loops is that we don't need to write the same code multiple times, just like we saw in the previous example. We will be looking at 4 types of loops in this video. These are while loop, do while loop, for loop, and for each loop. Let's begin the while loop and understand the logic behind its working. Look at this code with the while loop. Now, if you see, along with the while loop, we have this condition which is mostly a Boolean expression. If the condition is true, the block of code within the curly braces gets executed. Once this code block is executed, the condition is evaluated again. And if the condition is again true, the block of code is executed again. This continues like a loop until the condition evaluates to false, after which the code after the while block gets executed. So, a while loop executes a block of code if and as long as a specific condition is true. If we want to represent while loop using a flowchart, we can represent it like this. If the condition is true, the code block is executed infinitely until it becomes false. So to avoid this infinite loop, the code block within the loop must be written in such a way that it keeps changing the condition expression at every iteration, so that at one point, the loop will definitely end. Let us understand this better with the help of this example. This is a program to print the first 10 even numbers. After the while loop, we have a condition n is less than equal to 10, which means the loop will continue as long as the variable n is less than or equal to 10. Above this line, we have declared the value of n variable as 1, which means the condition is true and the code block will execute. Within the loop, we are printing the value of n by multiplying it by 2 to get the corresponding even numbers. And we are also incrementing n's value by 1. This is important as it ensures that after 10 iterations, the value of n will become 11, which would evaluate the condition to false, making the while loop to end. So let's check the output. We can see the first 10 even numbers printed, and this is how we can use a while loop in PHP. Now, what if within the loop, some other condition evaluates to be true? What should we do in such a case? In this case, we break the loop using the break keyword. This will immediately take the control to the next line of the loop. Let's modify our code example which we used earlier. We will add an if condition that if n is equal to 5, then break the loop. So this outer while condition would have run the loop 10 times, but now as we have used an if condition, the loop will break when n equals 5. And it will move out of the while loop and continue to execute the code blocks if present. Since in our example, we don't have any code outside the while loop, the code execution will stop after printing the first 5 even numbers. This means our program will now print only the first 5 even numbers like this. You might be wondering that we could have printed the first 5 even numbers by modifying the while condition and avoided the explicit use of the break keyword. Yes, definitely. But this example is just to explain how we can break a loop while using the break keyword. Similar to break, we have another keyword continue. To understand how it works, let us first replace the break keyword with continue in our code. Think for a moment and see what would be the output of this code. The code will print the first 5 even numbers, but will print the last even number, that is 10, infinitely. Let us understand why. When our code comes to this block of code, it skips the remaining code of the current iteration, that is, it skips n++. This is because after the condition we have used continue. So our code continues with the next iteration of the loop, where it prints 5 into 2 equal to 10 again. So n remains unchanged. It again satisfies the if condition and the same thing continues. And it continues infinitely without ever coming out of the loop. So that was how the continue keyword works. I hope you have now understood how we can use break and continue in a loop. Now a quick question. Let's say we swap these lines with each other. What will be the output in this case? You may pause the video and think of the answer. Also, remember that the code is executed line by line. The output will be the numbers 4, 6, 8, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20 and 22. Let us understand how. Swapping these lines means we are first incrementing the variable and then printing the number. So, here we have defined the value of variable n as 1. The moment it comes to this line, the value of n is incremented by 1. This means the value of n is now 2. Now coming to this line, it will print value 2 multiplied by 2, that is 4. So this is a loop. The value of n is again incremented by 1 and the value becomes 3, which will print the value as 6. Similarly, it will print 8 for the value 4. But the moment the value of n becomes 5, which evaluates to true, the remaining code of the current iteration is skipped. This means that this part of the code is ignored and 10 will not be printed. And the loop continues for the variable values 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11, printing 12, 14, 16, 18, 20 and 22 respectively. When the value of n becomes 11, the loop terminates because now the value of n is not less than equal to 10. That was all about while loop in PHP. In the next video, we will explore the remaining loops in PHP. After going through this video, you will be able to apply do while, for and for each loop in a PHP code. In the previous video, we discussed the while loop. In this video, we will start with the second type of loop, that is do while loop. To understand this loop, let us again come back to our previous code example. The do while loop is very similar to the while loop, except that here the condition is checked at the exit point instead of the entry point. This ensures that the code block inside the loop will run at least once, even if the condition fails for the very first time. If we look at the output of this code, you will be amazed to see that the output remains the same. That is, it prints the first 10 even numbers. Let's see how. Here, we have declared the variable value as 1. At this point, it will print the value 2 and after that it will increment the value of n by 1. At the end, here, it will check if the value of n is less than equal to 10, which evaluates to true. So it will again enter the loop and in a similar way will print the remaining even numbers. Just like in the case of while loop, the break and continue keywords work in an exact manner for all the loops, and this brings us to a small exercise which you have to do on your own. Download the given PHP code from below the video and use break and continue keywords one by one in the code and observe the output by changing the condition. Next, we have the for loop, and to understand this, let us use the same code example. Let us use the for loop in this code. So here on the left side we have the code in which we have used the while loop, and on the right side we have the code with for loop. The logic behind the for loop is similar to the while loop, and the only difference is the way the syntax is written. We can see that the syntax is concise as compared to the while or do while loops, and this syntax is new and we have not used it earlier in the while loop and do while loop. So a for loop has three parts. The first is initialization, then we have condition, and the third one is iteration. Now, the initialization can be any expression that is executed only once before the loop starts. In our case, it is the value of n as 1 which we have defined. We basically give our variable a value here. The second part is the condition n equals to less than 10, which gets evaluated and checked every time at the start of each iteration. If the condition evaluates to true, only then the code block within the loop is executed, otherwise the loop breaks. And the third part is iteration, that is increment of the variable, which can be any expression that gets executed every time. This is responsible for loop control and has been added to the iteration part of the for loop. This remaining line of the code remains within the curly braces for the for loop. So, this is how we can write the same code used to print the first 10 even numbers using a for loop. Note that for loop is a more concise way of writing code. Now, coming to the last type of loop, that is for each loop. Let's discuss this one also. It is a special loop that is created only for arrays. Let's have a look at the syntax of for each loop to understand it better. The syntax is for each, the name of the array, as followed by the variable name. The loop runs as many times as the number of elements present in the array. So, if the array has 10 elements, it will run 10 times. And if it has 20 elements, it will run 20 times. And in each iteration, it picks up one element of the array and assigns it to the variable for us to use. Let's look at an example in which we have used the for each loop. Here, we have an array that contains 5 different numbers. This means that the loop will run for 5 times and there is no need to use an additional loop control variable. The array is stored in a variable $arr. Then, we have a for each loop followed by the iteration. For each iteration, the different values of the array will be assigned to the variable num, which will be printed by this statement. And once all the numbers are printed, the loop will terminate itself. So that was all about various loops in PHP. In the next topic, we will continue to learn more about for each loop along with arrays. But up next is a quiz, so all the best. After going through this video, you will be able to explain an array, list down the types of array, explain numeric indexed array. We already know what arrays are and how they are used in a for each loop. In this video, we will first revisit the basics of arrays and then we will understand the different types of arrays. So let's get started. An array is a collection of some values that are of the same data type. These values can be an integer, string, float, or anything. But for a single array, the values must be of the same data type. We cannot have an integer, a float, and a string value in the same array. Each value in an array is referred to as an array element. An array, no matter how big, can be stored in a variable. This is why arrays are used, as they can store a number of elements together in a single variable. For example, let's say we want to store the names of these 10 students of a college. Now to store these 10 names, we can use either 10 different variables, or we can simply use one array of length 10 and can store all the names in an array as all the elements are of the same data type. The elements of the array are then accessed by the variable name using an ID, which is called an array index. In PHP, the array indices are of two types, and on that basis we have classified arrays into two types: numeric indexed array and associative array. Let us start first with the numeric indexed array. As the name suggests, this array has a numeric index that starts from 0. For example, we have this numeric indexed array. Here, $precedence is the name of the variable in which we have stored the array. All the elements are stored inside the parenthesis separated by a comma. Also, we have the elements as strings or texts, and they have to be put inside inverted commas as we have done here. So this first element will have index 0, second element will have index 1, and the third element will have index 2. Now, to print any of these elements, we need to use their corresponding array index. Say, we want to print George. So we will first use the variable name followed by the index value 0 inside the square brackets like this. Similarly, we can print the second and third element like this. We can also replace any existing element in the array. Say we want to update the name of the first element. What we have to do is simply first write the array index corresponding to the element equal to the updated value like this. So this will update the element present in the index 0. Suppose in this array we want to add a new element. As we have already created this array and have assigned it to a variable, so how can we add a new element? Well, it's pretty simple. We just need to add the index number which is immediate next to the index of the last element in the array. So in our array, the last index value was 2. So we need to use index 3 here and we'll simply assign it the element value like this. One more thing. We can also define the array element by element like this. It entirely depends on how we want to define an array. Before we end this video, we have a small exercise. In the previous video, we studied that for each loops are specially used for arrays. So what you have to do is use a for each loop to print all the elements in this array. In the next video, we will learn the remaining array, that is associative along with multi-dimensional array. After going through this video, you will be able to explain associative array, explain a multi-dimensional array. Let us continue our discussion on the types of array. Associative arrays have strings or texts as its indices. These arrays are particularly used when the indices and their association with the values are more important than the values alone. For example, here on the left side, we have the names of the US presidents, and on the right side, we have the year in which they were first elected. Now, if we store only the values that are the years, the information will be less significant. So, here the indices are important, that is, names of the presidents, which makes the information useful and complete. Now, this association of indices with the values is called a key-value pair, where the indices are the keys and the years are the values. So, in our case, we have 4 key-value pairs. Now, let us assume we can define an associative array. Here, years is a variable in which we have stored the array. Inside the brackets, we put all the key value associations separated by comma. Now, each association has a key inside inverted commas, as it's a string followed by equal to greater than sign that looks like an arrow, followed by the value. Here the value is an integer, hence they are without the inverted commas. So in this associative array, we have 3 key value pairs. Also, printing the element in case of associative arrays is simple. Say, we want to print the value corresponding to Barack. Can you guess what value we will enter here? It will be Barack because in case of associative arrays, the indices are the strings or the texts, which in this case is Barack. Similarly, we can replace the value of an element like this, and we can add a new element like this. It works exactly the same as we have done in the case of numeric indexed arrays, with the only difference in the indices. Also, we can define this array element by element like this. In the case of associative arrays, we can use the for each loop like this to print all the elements. Your task is to run this code and observe the output on your own. Next, we have a multi-dimensional array. These are the arrays of arrays, which simply means each element of an array is also an array. These arrays can be of anything like integer or string or any other data type, but cannot be a combination of each other. Let us understand how we can define a multi-dimensional array with the help of this example. Suppose we want to store the marks of 3 different students for various subjects. So here in one array we are storing the marks of 3 subjects. Here we have an associative array that stores the marks of a student named Amit for 3 subjects: physics, chemistry and mathematics. Similarly, we have 2 more associative arrays that store marks of 2 more students, Chirag and Vandana. And now say we want to store all these student records combined into another array. And to do this, we create an associative array like this. But if you notice, the elements in this array $A, $B, and $C are all arrays in itself. $students in such a case is a multi-dimensional array where the array elements is an array in itself. We can in fact alternatively replace the $A, $B, and $C with the arrays they store, and the code will become like this. Once you get accustomed, you might directly prefer to write this code just like this, instead of using intermediate variables to store the arrays. Just like any other array, to iterate through this multi-dimensional array, we have to use a for each loop like this. Note that the code on the right is the continuation of the code on the left side. Here, the $students array contains 3 elements. This means that the loop will run 3 times. And in each iteration, it picks up one key value association and assigns the key to the first variable $student and the value to the second variable $subjects. So, for the first iteration, $student will contain Amit and $subjects will contain the array associated with Amit. Now for the second iteration, $student will contain Chirag and $subjects will contain the array associated with Chirag. And similarly, it will be for the third iteration. Interestingly, the values $subjects in each case of the 3 interactions are arrays in itself. So, we have to use another for each loop to iterate through the array $subjects. Since, even though this array contains 3 elements, this loop will also run 3 times. And here, in each iteration, it picks up one key value association and assigns the key to the first variable $subject and the value to the second variable $mark. So, for the first iteration for Amit, $subject will become physics and $mark will become 77. For the second iteration, $subject will be chemistry and $mark will be 86, and so on and so forth. So once this array iteration is completed, it will come out of this loop and will go to the next iteration of the outer loop. And then for Chirag, the inner loop will continue just like we explained moments back, and so on for Vandana. This is called a nested loop, a loop inside another loop. The outer loop will run 3 times, as the outer array contains 3 elements, and for each of the elements in the outer array, the inner loop will run 3 times. So technically, the inner loop runs 3 into 3 times. For any multi-dimensional array, we would need to use a nested loop in order to access its elements. Now that we have reached the end of this topic, let us quickly summarize the differences between the types of array, that is numeric indexed array and associative array. First, the numeric indexed array is a collection of the same kind of information, whereas an associative array is a collection of a pair of information. Next, in a numeric indexed array, the order in which we present information is important, while in the case of an associative array, the association between the pair of information is important. Next, the way we define both the numeric indexed and associative array is different from one another. In case of a numeric indexed array, we can access any element of the array using the numeric index. And for an associative array, we can access any element of the array using the key index, which is in string format. Lastly, the way we loop through a number indexed array and an associative array is different to each other. So that was all about arrays. Up next is a quiz. After going through this video, you will be able to define a string using double and single quotes, explain escape character. Strings are very important in any programming language. We can define a string as a text or a sequence of characters. No matter how big the text is, it can all be stored in one variable. But the most important thing is that a string must be defined within quotes like we have defined. To define a string, we can use either single quotes or double quotes. They are almost the same, except that the double quotes replace any variable within it with the value it holds and also convert escape sequence into special characters. We will understand what we mean by this statement shortly in this video. Now, before we proceed further, let us first understand what escape characters are. Escape characters are denoted by a backward slash and escapes the character that follows it. For example, /n/t are a few examples of escape characters. We will understand these escape characters shortly. But first, let us understand what we mean by escaping the characters. It means it either adds a special meaning to the character, or if the character is already special, the escape character then removes its special meaning and treats it like a normal text character. The examples which we discussed earlier, that is /n and /t, they both add a special meaning to the characters n and t respectively. Because as /n represents a new line, it means the escape character, that is slash, has added a special meaning to the character n. And similarly, /t represents a tab space with the special character adding a special meaning to the character t. Here, we have this code in which we have used an escape character. If you have to guess, what would be the output of this code? Don't worry, just give it a try, it is simple. This code will print "Hello Joe" followed by a new line, and in the new line it will print "Hope you are having a great time," which you can see in the page source. But the browser, while rendering, converts all white spaces into a single space. So this new line gets converted to a single space in the final output. Let's understand how we got this output. Since here in the first print statement, the $name is a variable which is holding a string value, Joe. Just to reiterate, strings are written within a pair of single or double quotes. Next, we have the first print statement. This prints the line "Hello Joe." Then we have an escape character /n which adds a new line. And this next print statement prints the string as such. We also said earlier that an escape character removes the special meaning from the special character. Let us understand how we can remove the special meaning from a special character from the same code which we used earlier. This is the code we used earlier. In this code, we have the $name variable that has a special meaning as this stores some value. In this case, it stores the string Joe. If we use an escape character before the variable name in the echo statement, it will treat this variable as a normal text. Let me run this code. Here, we can see $name is printed as such in the output. Now in the same code, we have one more special character which you need to find out on your own. And once you find it out, I would recommend you to add an escape character before that and observe the output on your own. Now, say we want our output to be like this, that is, we want to add the name Joe inside the double quotes. Can you guess how we can do this? Well, we all might have guessed it as it seems pretty simple. Just add the double quotes to the variable and it's done. If that's what you were thinking too, you got this wrong. The output will show a syntax error. This is because these double quotes are treated as special double characters indicating the start and end of a string. So, is there any way around this? Yes, absolutely. We simply need to add a backslash before these double quotes, which will remove the special meaning of these special characters and will print the name Joe inside the double quotes. Next, let's come to the use of single quotes in a string. We have already seen this code and the output where we used double quotes to define a string. Let us change the double quote to a single quote here and see the output. Any guesses? Well, using a single quote in this print statement will print the entire string as such without any change. The variable $name is printed as such and even the escape sequence /n. This means that if we use a single quote to define a string, it will simply print the string as such even if we have used an escape sequence or defined a variable within the single quotes. So, that was about using double and single quotes to define a string. Lastly, in this video, we will cover the string concatenation operator. It is denoted by a dot and is used to concatenate two strings. Means the dot is used to join two strings. Let's have a look at an example. Here, in the print statement, we have three substrings that are concatenated using a string concatenation operator. And if you want to see the output, you have to execute the code on your own. You can find this code below the video. With this, we come to the end of this video. Up next is an exercise. After going through this video, you will be able to explain and define a function, explain the parts of a function, explain the execution of a function. Functions in PHP are very important as they allow the developers to use a block of code repeatedly in a program and it performs a specific task. To understand more about functions in detail, let us first look at an example of how a function looks like. This will help us to build a solid understanding of what functions are and how they are defined. Here, this entire piece of code is a function that performs a specific task and has a name associated with it. In PHP, a function starts with the function keyword which is followed by the name of the function. In our case, we have taken the function name as getMax. Then, a function can take some data which is used to perform some tasks. This data is called function arguments. In our case, $A and $B are the function arguments. Also, note that a function can take any number of arguments. Once the tasks are performed, the function returns some value but can only return one value at a time. So let us summarize what a function is. It is a block of code that can be repeatedly used in a program to perform a specific task. Functions can take data to perform tasks, and those data are called function arguments. Functions can take any number of arguments but can only return one value at a time. Now that we know what a function is, let us understand how we can define a function in PHP. As discussed earlier, to define a function, we first use the function keyword followed by the name of the function. Then, within the brackets, we specify function arguments. We can have as many function arguments as we want. All we have to do is separate these arguments using a comma. Like in this case, we have two function arguments separated by a comma. Then inside the curly braces, we have our main code. Based on the logic, we can put a return statement anywhere inside the main code block. It stops the function's code execution and returns the value that we specify. So, this was all about defining a function. Now, let us look at another important aspect of functions, that is, how they are executed. And for the same, we first need to understand the parts of function. Let us take the same code example with a slight modification. This is the first part called as function definition. In function definition, we define the function name, function arguments, and a block of code which defines the specific purpose. And the second part is function calling, which calls or invokes the function. This is the modification which we were earlier talking about. Function calling is the part when the function actually gets executed. So now as we are familiar with the parts of the function, let us see how it is executed. First, the line number 2 gets executed in which we have defined the function. Now the next line which is executed is the place where we have called the function. Can you guess the line number? It's 9. Easy, right? Once the function is executed, it again goes back to line 2 and initializes the arguments being passed. Now, the execution continues line by line till it encounters a return statement or the function ends. In our case, the value of variable a is 5 and the value of variable b is 10. So, the if condition is false and the else condition is true. This will return the value 10. Again, the code execution goes back to line number 9 and initializes $max with what the function returns, which is 10. Lastly, the code prints 10 and the program ends. We will continue our discussion on functions in the next video, so stay tuned. After going through this video, you will be able to list various rules and conventions to name a function, assign default values to function arguments, explain the difference between a local and global variable, explain global variables with the help of an example. In the previous video, we learned about functions like how to define them, what are the different parts that make a function, how a function is executed. But there are still a few more exciting things we can explore about functions, starting with how to name a function. To name a function, we follow certain rules and conventions. First is, a function name can only contain alphanumeric characters or the underscore. It cannot have any of the special characters like exclamation, dash, or even a dollar. Next, a function name cannot start with a number. It must start either with an alphabet or an underscore. Next, if a function name contains 2 or more words, we need to use an underscore to separate them. Lastly, the name of the function should be self-explanatory. That is, just by looking at the name of a function, one should be able to tell what the function does. For example, in our code, we use the function name getMax. We can see that this function name ticks all the rules and conventions that we have listed down. Also, the name of the function is self-explanatory, as it tells us the maximum of a group of numbers. We can also assign default values to function arguments. For example, the code which we used earlier, we were assigning the values to the function arguments when the function was being called. So instead of assigning values here, we can also assign values to function arguments here. Let us define the value 0 to the second function argument b. This default value comes into play only when we are calling the function, as we don't pass a value for these arguments. In our case, we have defined the value of the function argument a when the function is being called, but we have not defined the value of b here. So, when the program is being executed, the function argument b will automatically be assigned the value 0, which we have defined in the function definition part. Now, if we run the code, we will see the output as 0 like this. You might be curious to know what if we pass the value of the function argument b while calling the function. This means the value of function argument is defined at two places, one at the function definition part and one at the function calling part. And in both the parts, the value of b is different. So which value of b will the program take while executing? In such cases where we explicitly pass the values of function arguments, the default value is ignored and is replaced by the new value. This means in our code, the value of the function argument b will become 10. And if we execute the code, we can see the output as 10. Next, we have another concept, scope of a variable. It means that how a variable is defined in a function, and depending on the way it is defined, the variable behaves differently. There are two ways in which a variable is defined in a function, that is, locally and globally, and we call the variables in such cases as local and global variables respectively. When a variable is defined within the function, it is called a local variable, and in such cases, the variable is available only inside that function. For example, this is the code which we used earlier. In this case, the variable is defined locally as it is defined inside the function getMax. Coming to global variables, these are the variables that are defined outside a function and are available anywhere outside the functions but never inside of any function. Sounds complicated, right? Let us simplify this with the help of this example and its output. Here, we have defined a variable named ABC and we have initialized it with hello world. Since the variable is defined outside of any function, it is a global variable and is not available from inside of any function. Next, we have defined a function a in which we have initialized a variable with hey. Even though this variable's name is the same as that of the global variable abc, this variable is totally different. This is because global variables are not accessible from inside of any function. So when we write $abc for the first time inside a function, it is treated like an unknown variable. And when we initialize it with some value, it is defined as a new local variable whose scope is just within this a function. This makes the global variable remain unaffected outside. Next, we have defined another function b that simply prints the variable abc. But here, $abc is an unknown variable, and since here we are printing it without initializing any value to it locally, it remains undefined. This means it will print nothing and will show us a message as undefined variable. Then we have simply called the function a, which will print hey without affecting the global variable abc. After this, we have again called the function b. This will print nothing as the local variable is not initialized with any value. And lastly, we are printing the global variable abc. Since the global variable is not changed anywhere, once it has been initialized, it will print hello world. So, based on our understanding of the execution of this program, the output should be this. Let us run the program and see if it matches with the output that we have calculated. Good job. The output is exactly the same as we have calculated. Global variables is an extensive topic which we will continue to explore in the next video. See you then. After going through this video, you will be able to explain why global variables behave differently in PHP, access a global variable from inside a function, access a global variable using a predefined built-in associative array $globals, explain super global variables. In the last video, we saw how global variables are defined in a function. But the way global variables behave in PHP is different from other programming languages. Let us understand why global variables work differently in PHP. We will again use the same code that we used earlier to define a global variable. Assume that this piece of code is too long and is written by some other member of your team. In this code, your team member has declared a global variable abc that you are not aware of. Now, when we were writing the code, we first defined a function A, and unknowingly we also defined the same variable name. This means in the same code we have a variable name that is defined both globally and locally. So, if PHP had allowed global variables to be accessed from inside the functions, this would unknowingly replace the value of global variable ABC to hey without us even realizing it. Also, whenever $ABC is used, which is expected to hold the value hello world, it will now hold the value hey all across the code. This might not seem to be a big deal in the current example, but this may have a very severe impact in real world where multiple developers work on the same code. To avoid this, in PHP, the scope of global variables are not made available inside the functions. There might be one question popping in our heads right now. Is it possible to access the global variables from inside a function at all? Well, the answer is yes. And we can do this by using the global keyword. Let us take the help of this code to understand. Here in this code, we have defined a global variable ABC here. To use this global variable from inside a function, we use the global keyword followed by the variable name like this. And once this global variable is used from inside a function, even if we assign a variable with the same name, that is ABC, it will not create a new local variable ABC and will only refer to the global variable. So here, inside the function A, the value of the global variable ABC will be replaced with hey. And even this print statement will print the value of the variable as hey. So, based on our understanding, the program should print hey 2 times. Let us run the program. Yup, we can see that hey is printed 2 times in the output. There is one more fascinating fact about global variables. That is, whenever they are defined, they automatically get added to a predefined built-in associative array, $globals. Note that the name of this array is defined in capital letters as it is a convention that we need to follow. We will learn more about it shortly in this video. For now, let us again come back to where we have defined the global variable ABC equal to hello world. When we do this, an element with a key ABC and its value as hello world gets added to the array $globals. Now, why are we talking about the key value pair? This is because associative arrays are always defined this way. This is something which we have already discussed earlier in this module. So based on the $globals array, we can think of this variable to be defined like this. And similarly, the global variables can be accessed by using the associative array $globals like this. Here, the value of the global variable $abc is replaced with hey and is printed. Even the echo $abc statement outside the function will print hey. This means we will get hey 2 times as the output. Let us quickly run and validate our results. There we go, the output shows hey being printed 2 times. A few moments back in the video, we discussed why the built-in associative array is written in all capital letters and it is a naming convention. We will follow this naming convention for all the built-in associative arrays like $post, $get, $files and many more. These built-in associative arrays are called as superglobal variable. This means these are all superglobal variables and we need to use capital letters to name them. Now, you might be interested to know what is a superglobal variable. A superglobal variable is a variable that is always available in all scopes. That is, it can be accessed from anywhere, whether from outside a function or from inside a function. There are a few things that are associated with them. First, each superglobal variable has a specific purpose. Next, they are built in and there is no way we can define them on our own, although we can modify them. Next, they are always in the form of an associative array. Lastly, they are named in capital letters as a convention. We will learn more about them in our upcoming topics. With this, we come to the end of this video. Hope you are having a great learning experience. Up next is a quiz. All the best. After going through this video, you will be able to call a function by reference. So far, the way we have been passing arguments to a function is known as call by value. For example, we have this code in which we have a function add1 which increases the value of the variable passed to it by 1. The function takes a variable as argument $n and increments it by 1 and returns it. When we call this function, we pass a value to it and expect a value back that we store back in the variable. The return value is expected to be incremented by 1. So, here we take a variable $num that initially stores 0 and pass it to the function and store the returned value in the same variable $num, which now becomes 1 and we print it. This is a fairly simple code, right? But if we modify our code a bit, like remove the return statement from the function or simply do not store the returned value, it would not change the value of $num and would print 0 instead. This is because when we pass a variable to a function, a duplicate copy of the variable is created. Changes to one of the copy inside the function doesn't affect the second copy outside the function. So any changes made in the function have to be explicitly returned and stored back in a variable outside. We have already learned the variables have different scope. So in PHP, we have one more way to pass arguments to a function that is known as call by reference. Here, if you notice, we have added an ampersand before the variable name in the argument of the function. So now when we pass a variable to this function, it will not create a duplicate copy. Rather, the argument will point to the variable. Any change to the argument will automatically affect the variable being passed. We will not require to return the changed value and store it back outside. So here we increment $n from 0 to 1. $num also changes to 1 and this code would print 1 despite the function not returning the incremented value. So to pass a variable by reference, we simply need to add an ampersand before the variable name in the argument of the function. It will not create a duplicate copy and will simply point to the same variable being passed. Any change to the argument inside the function will change the value of the variable being passed to it. Well, that was all in the video. Up next is a quiz. All the best. After going through this video, you will be able to explain method and action attributes, why post request method is preferred in form submission, how the post request is processed by a web server, differences between a get and post request method, importance of get requests using various examples. We all are familiar with this form because this is the same form which we have created when we were in our first module of this training. Some of you might have tried to submit the form out of curiosity after filling it, but nothing significant happened, right? This is because one line of code was missing from this entire code. And this is the line of code that makes the form submissions work. So in this video, we will learn about how form submission works and various concepts associated with it. First things first, to make any form submission work, we must add two attributes to the form tag, and these are method and action. We will shortly understand what we mean by these terms and the values they hold. We have already written the code for this form in an HTML file and saved it as form.html. So when we want to enter this form, we enter the relative URL 127.0.0.1/form.html. This will initiate a HTTP request by the browser, and when the browser receives the response, it simply renders and displays the form to us. Next, we will enter the required information as asked in the form and will submit the form. Now, as we submit the form, a new HTTP request is generated from the browser. This new request which is generated is for the URL mentioned in the action attribute, that is submit.php. This new HTTP request which is generated takes all the data that we have entered in the form. Can you think of how the data goes along with this HTTP request? You may pause the video and think for a moment. And to help you a bit, you may refer to the form here. If you thought the answer as key value pairs, you are right. The keys are the names of the form elements like password, gender, interest, and so on, and the values are the values that are re-entered by the user. Basically, these are key value pairs that go with the HTTP request. So this was all about the action attribute. Next, we have the method attribute. There are two types of method requests. One is get and the other is post. We will learn about these requests shortly in detail. First, we will see why in the case of form submission we prefer a post request instead of a get request. Here on the left side, we have a form in which we have used a GET request, and on the right side, we have used the POST request. When the GET method is used for form submission, the browser adds the submitted form data to the end of the new URL as key value pairs, where the keys are the names of the form elements and values are the values entered by the user. We can see in the URL, sensitive user information is being displayed. This information can also get stored in the user history, which is not a good thing as it can be exploited by hackers. Now, if we look at the case where we have used the POST request, we can see that after submitting the form, no information is added in the URL. This makes it more secure. Due to this very reason, POST request method is used in most form submissions, but GET method has its own advantages, which we will shortly discuss why and where GET method is preferred. So, what happens on the server side when the web server receives the HTTP request? This happens in multiple steps. First, we know the HTTP request that goes to the web server is for a PHP file, that is submit.php. As we know, PHP is a server-side scripting language. The web server will start looking for this file on its computer and will start executing it. As the file is executed, the web server converts the key value data into an associative array that can be accessed through PHP. Depending on the type of method attribute used, the associative array is stored in $get and $post superglobal variables, which we can use to access these data. We have already discussed in detail what superglobal variables are in the previous topic. We can further use this user data to store in the database. Now, how to store the data in the database, we will understand in the next topic. Now that we have understood the method and action attributes, we will continue to explore more about these request methods, starting with the difference between them. As discussed earlier, in GET-REQUEST, the user data gets visible in the URL upon form submission, which makes it less secure. While in the case of a POST request, no data is visible in the URL, making it secure. The data in case of a GET and a POST request is stored in $get and $post superglobal variables respectively. Generally, most of the requests are GET based. This means when we type any URL 127.0.0.1/form.html or when we click any anchor tag, the request generated is always GET based. While in case of form submissions, we can choose between a GET and a POST request. Now you might be curious to know, if POST request is secure, then why do we need to use GET request at all? To understand this, let us make a few searches on the internet. To begin with, let us first search for web development internships. If we notice the URL, we can say that here a form submission is taking place. This is because the information which we entered is being displayed in the URL along with some additional information that Google uses for its internal use. Next, let us search for our all-time favorite song on YouTube. Again, we can see in the URL the search query that we entered is being displayed in the URL. If we search for a different song this time, different search results appear. And similarly, if we search any product in Amazon, or if we want to search our favorite sneakers on Myntra, we will observe the same thing. So, based on our findings, we can say that in case of search, a web page's content is totally dependent on the search data, that is the form data. So, where we want to share some URL with our friends, GET requests are of great importance. Like here, we have these smartphones which we have shortlisted after applying several filters. So if any of our friends open the link which we have shared, they will be able to see the exact phones with all the filters pre-applied. This is possible only because Amazon, along with all the websites that use search-specific information, they use the GET method in their search functionality. Had it been a POST method, our friends would have always landed on the homepage of Amazon. In a nutshell, in forms, GET method is used when a user needs to retrieve some specific information based on the submitted form data, while in all other cases, the POST method is used. So that's all about form submission in this video. Up next is an exercise. Please make sure that you complete this exercise as the content of the next topic is dependent on this. After going through this video, you will be able to explain the importance of database related functions in PHP, explain the communication between client, server and the DBMS, install PHP extension in Linux OS. Imagine yourself in some other country where the language is different from our own countries. How difficult would it be to buy stuff, ask for directions, or even to order a cup of tea? You would wish if you had a list to help you out with all these things. Wouldn't that be amazing? Similarly, when we talk about communicating with databases, things seem easy because we have PHP functions that help us execute SQL queries to communicate with the database. So in this video, we will understand about these PHP functions and how we can use them to store and fetch data from a database. To start with, let us go back to the college placement example where we used SQL queries to enter and fetch data from the database. Here, we took a small amount of data to understand the concept. What would happen if we had to add data of 1000 new students who have joined the college? Wouldn't it be tiring and a time-taking task for us to have to manually enter the data 1000 times? This means we have to manually execute 1000 SQL queries to enter the data of 1000 students. To our rescue, we have PHP, through which we can run these SQL queries automatically. This means whenever a new student is placed, the student is automatically added with the help of PHP. Before we begin with the PHP functions, we need to first develop an understanding of how the communication occurs between the client and the database. First, as we know, the browser initiates an HTTP request to the web server for a PHP file. Then the web server will find the PHP file on its computer. As it is a PHP file, the web server will start executing the file as PHP is a backend language. While executing the file, the web server encounters some PHP code that wants to communicate with the database or the DBMS with the help of SQL queries. The DBMS will fetch the data based on the request and will send the response back to the PHP code. One interesting fact here, the PHP is making a request to the DBMS asking for some data. This means PHP is acting as a client to the DBMS. And once the entire PHP file is executed, the response is sent to the browser, which then renders it and displays it. Now, let us come to another interesting part of this video, where we will have a look at some of the built-in PHP functions that help us to communicate with the DBMS. In short, we call them database-related functions. If you are a Linux user, we need to first install a PHP extension before we start communicating with the database. To do this, open the terminal. Enter the command sudo apt get install php-mysql. Here, php-mysql is the extension which we want to install. You can also find this command below the video. Just copy and paste it in your terminal. Next, run the command and enter your password if prompted. Press Y to confirm. After this, it might take some time to complete the installation depending on your internet's bandwidth. Once the installation is complete, we need to go to this folder location. Now locate the file php.ini and open it in the edit mode. To open the file in edit mode, you need to enter cd space hash etc hash php hash 7.4 hash apache 2. Note that here the version is 7.4. If you are using a different version, please change the value in the command accordingly. Now enter sudo gedit php.ini. This will open the file in the edit mode. Next, we will search for the line with the extension equal to mysqli. Remove the semicolon and save and exit the file. Lastly, we will restart the Apache using sudo service apache 2 restart command. Now, we will be able to use some of the built-in PHP functions to communicate with the database. Next, for the users using Windows operating system, we don't need to install anything as the PHP comes with some built-in database related functions. In the next video, we will look at some of the most widely used built-in database related functions that are used to communicate with the DBMS. After going through this video, you will be able to explain various database related functions, use database related functions. So far, we know that database related functions help us to communicate with the database. Let us understand a few database related functions in detail. First, we have a MySQLi connect function. As the name suggests, it is used to establish a connection with the MySQL server. And this is the query that we need to use to establish the connection. This query has 4 parameters. The host name parameter is the domain name or the IP address of the computer on which the MySQL server is running. If you have to guess the IP address of the computer on which the MySQL server is running, what would that be? The IP address will be 127.0.0.1 as the MySQL server and the web server are running on the same computer. The next parameter is the MySQL username, which in our case by default is root. Next is password parameter. And lastly, we have the name of the database parameter to which we want to communicate. $con is the reference object which represents the connection to the MySQL server. If the information of any of these parameters is incorrect while running the SQL query, the function will return a false value. This means it has failed to establish a connection. Suppose we could not establish the connection with the MySQL server. To establish the connection, we first need to identify the issue. So, is there any function in the PHP that can help us to identify the reason? The answer to our question is yes. We have a MySQLi connect error function that returns the last error message from the last call to MySQLi connect. This function returns the value as an error message that describes the error. Also, note that we don't use any parameter to use this function. Next, we have the MySQLi query function. It helps to execute an SQL query on the selected database. This is the syntax for this function. This is the function. And this SQL query takes two parameters. The first one is the connection reference object, which we have already discussed earlier. And the second parameter is the SQL query in the form of a string. This function returns a false value if due to any reason the query fails to execute. And it returns the value as true if the query is executed successfully. For select queries, it returns a reference object. Now, this reference object contains some data which can be accessed using the MySQLi fetch assoc function. And we can use this function like this. This is the name of the function and this is the reference object that we got from the MySQLi query function. Suppose this is the new data which we have fetched from the students table using the select query. This PHP function will fetch the first row and moves the internal pointer to the next row. Also, the single row data that is fetched is in the form of an associative array with the table attribute names as the key and the corresponding data stored as the values. So, the next time we use this PHP function, it will fetch the second row and will move the pointer to the next row. Similarly, the function fetches all the rows and when there is no row left, it returns the value as false. Next, similar to the MySQLi connection function, we have MySQLi error function. This function returns the last error message for the last call to the MySQLi query. This means if our SQL query fails to execute, using this function we can get the exact reason of the failure as an error message. This is the syntax that we use to use this function, in which we can see that it takes the connection reference object as the parameter. Lastly, we have MySQLi close function. This function closes the previously opened connection with the MySQL server. To close the connection, we pass the connection reference object along with the function name like this. Although the connection with the MySQL server is automatically closed once the entire PHP code is executed. But we should close the connection as a good practice as it also helps to free the resources used. Before we proceed further, let us quickly summarize the functions which we have learned so far using the client-server communication diagram. The first step is to establish the connection with the MySQL server, for which we will use the MySQL connect function. In case the connection does not get established, then we use the MySQLi connect error function to identify the issue. Once the connection is established, we use the MySQLi query function to run SQL queries on the connected database. And if due to any reason we are unable to execute the SQL queries, we have the MySQLi error function to identify the error message. Lastly, once the entire PHP code is executed, we close the connection using the MySQLi close function. In the next video, we will create a PHP file that will fetch the data a user will enter, and then we will store this data in a database. See you soon. After going through this video, you will be able to create a PHP file to fetch data from a form and store it in a table and the database as well. In this video, we will create two PHP files. In the first PHP file, we will see how we can add the data the user has entered after submitting the form to the database. And using the second PHP file, we will see how we can fetch the data from the database. To create the first PHP file, there are some prerequisites. Firstly, we need the registration form. This we have already created as an exercise in the previous topic. Next, we need a table to store the user data. If you remember, earlier in this training, in Module 4 Topic 5, we have already created a users table with the test database. We will be using the same table in this video. For the first PHP file, we will modify the register_submit.php file which you have created in the previous topic as an exercise. We will first define the 4 variables along with their values. A quick question. Can you tell why we need to define these variables? As you know, the first step is to establish the connection with the MySQL server, which is done using the MySQLi connect function, and this function uses these 4 parameters. Now, why we have entered the value of hostname as 127.0.0.1 and for the remaining variables, this is something we have already discussed in the previous video. Next, in our PHP code, we will write the SQL query that is used to establish the connection with the MySQL server. We are storing the connection reference object that MySQLi connect returns in a variable named $con. The function will return a false value if it fails to establish a connection with the MySQL server. Next, we will check using an if condition if it failed to establish the database connection. And if it fails, that is the value returned by the MySQLi connect function is false, we will print the error message using the MySQLi connect error function and exit after that. If the value returned by MySQLi connect function is true, we will first fetch the data that the user will enter in the registration form through the $post variable, which is an associative array and a superglobal variable. Here, the keys to the $post array have to be exactly the same as the names of the form elements in the registration form. Then, we will form an SQL query that will insert the data into the users table in the form of a row. We are generating a string using these user data that's a valid insert query and storing it in a variable. Insert into users, name, email, and password. These are the names of the attributes in the users table. Values. Then, user data needs to be inserted as a record into the users table. Please note the inverted commas around the variable names that store the user data. These inverted commas are needed because these fields are string or varchar and hence must be included inside the inverted commas in the query. $SQL now is a string that contains the exact SQL query we want to execute. Can you guess which function we will use next in our code? You may pause the video and refer to the communication diagram which we discussed earlier in the topic. If you have guessed the answer as MySQLi query function, then you are right. SQL queries are executed using the MySQLi query function. So, we will call this function and pass the SQL query we generated to it as a parameter. Here, we are storing the reference object that MySQLi query returns in a variable named result. Now, using an if condition, we will check if the MySQLi query function returns false, that is, if the query failed for some reason. If it does, that is, if the value returned by MySQLi function is false, we will print the error message using the MySQLi error function and exit after that. If the query is executed successfully, that is, if the value returned by MySQLi query function is true, we will write a statement that will print registration successful. At the end, we will close the MySQL connection using the MySQLi close function. Wait, I've made a mistake. I forgot to add a $sign before con in line number 8. So let me quickly add this. So this is how, using a PHP file, we can fetch user data from the submitted form and store it into a table. Before we proceed further to the next PHP file where we will see how to fetch data from the database, I would recommend you to thoroughly go through the code and its explanation, which we just discussed, as the logic for these PHP files is similar. As we have inserted the data into the table, it's now time to see how we can fetch data from a database using the MySQLi fetch assoc function. To do the same, we have the fetch_data PHP file. If we look at the code, most of the code is same as that of the register_submit.php file. First, we are defining the variables along with their values. Then we are using the MySQLi connect function to establish the connection. If the connection fails to establish, we will print the error message using MySQLi connect error function and exit the code. And if the connection is established successfully, we will use an SQL query that will fetch all the records from the users table. After that, we will execute the query using the MySQLi query function. If the query fails to execute, we print the error message using the MySQLi error function and exit. And if the query executes successfully, we will use the MySQLi fetch assoc function to fetch the data one row at a time. Please note that this single equal to is an assignment operator and not a comparison operator. It initializes $row with each row of the fetched data. Also, as we are using a while loop, it will continue to fetch each row till MySQLi fetch assoc function returns false, that is, there are no more rows left to be fetched. After that, inside the loop, we are simply printing the name associated with each row of the fetched data. And lastly, we will close the connection using the MySQLi close function. So when we execute this PHP file, it will print the names of all the users and will send the response to the browser, which will render and display the information to us. With this, we come to the end of this video. We created two PHP files, one file to fetch data from the submitted form and store it in the database, and the other file to fetch the data from the database and display it to the user. Up next is an exercise. After going through this video, you will be able to explain the basic concepts behind registration and login. In this video, we will understand a few key terms that are associated when we create a new account or sign up for a website. So let's get started. The first important term is registration or sign up. We all have already registered ourselves on the Intershala trainings website. And I'm sure you would have registered on many other websites like Facebook or Instagram or Gmail. Now, registration in simple words means creating an account on a website. Nowadays, almost all the websites have a registration form which additionally capture users' data and preferences such as language, location, interest, and many more. Websites use this information to give the users a customized experience. Whether it's Netflix, YouTube, Myntra, or any other website, based on the user's preference, they display information to them. A registration form contains some specific fields, including an email or a username and a password which a user has to fill in order to create an account. When a user enters all this information and submits the form, an account is created for the user and all this information is saved in their account. Next, we have identification and authentication. Once we create an account, we can log into the website by filling the details in the login form. In the login form, we usually have two fields. One is the username or the email field and the other is password. When we add the detail in the username or email field, we are basically trying to identify the user. And the password field authenticates that the user who is trying to log in is usually the same user who has created the account. Once the identification and authentication is successfully done, the user is then redirected to his custom dashboard or account. Let us take another example. We all use Facebook, right? In our friend list, we can see the usernames of our friends. Suppose we want to log in into the account of one of our friends. So we will take the username and we'll enter it in the login form. The form will show us the profile picture of the user. This is identification. But now, as we don't have the password, we won't be able to log in into the account. This means that even if we enter any password which is basically incorrect, Facebook won't authenticate us as the right user. Speaking about the login form, in the previous topic, that is database communication, we did an exercise where we made additions in the login_submit.php file. We add the code to check if the email and password entered in the form are exactly the same as that stored in the database like this. So here in the login_form web page, I will enter the email and password which we have already entered in the test database. And if it does not match, it will say login failed. But if it matches, it will print hello followed by the name as stored in the database. We will take the same file and continue to work around it. In case you have not created this file, I would recommend you to pause the video here and first create the file as per the guidelines mentioned in the exercise. Now, let's take this form a step forward. Suppose after successfully matching on the email and password, we want to add a link saying click here, which will take the user to the dashboard page. A dashboard is the page which contains user related information. For example, if you view your Intershala trainings dashboard, you can see the trainings for which you have enrolled along with some other information. This dashboard is too complex for now. So let us say the dashboard which we are talking about should only print hello followed by the user's name. To add the click here link in the login_submit page, what will you possibly do? That is, how will you add the anchor tag only when the email and password is correct? Or in other words, how to add the code snippet inside the PHP if condition. You may pause the video and think for a moment. Well, the answer is simple. Simply add the HTML code snippet in the echo statement. This is also a solution but not a convenient one. Here, it looked simple because the code snippet that we added was small. What if there was a bigger code block? In such cases, we have a more convenient and a simple way. We close the PHP tag where we want to add any non-PHP content and then open the PHP tag again like this. In our case, as the HTML code snippet is the non-PHP part, therefore we have closed the PHP tag before this snippet. And once we have added the HTML snippet, we have again opened the PHP tag. Also, note that we have added this snippet inside the if condition. This means the HTML code will be included only when the condition is true. Otherwise, it will be ignored. Now, the other underlying challenge here is to create the dashboard.php file which should print the name of the user after the user has successfully logged in. Just pause the video here and think how you will print the name of the user on dashboard.php. So here, even if we try to pass information from one file to another or any other method based on what we have learned so far in this training, we won't be able to print anything. Now, to understand the reason behind this, we have to go through the communication steps once again. Once the form is submitted, the browser initiates an HTTP request for the URL 127.0.0.1/login_submit.php. The data which the user has entered goes along with this form in the form of key-value pairs. The web server finds the requested file and will start executing it. It then fetches the username and password using the $post superglobal variable and matches with the username and password stored in the database. If the username and password matches, it will print the name along with the link to the dashboard.php file. Now, things become really interesting when the user clicks on the click here hyperlink which he got as a response from the browser. This will generate another HTTP request which this time is for dashboard.php file. Note that this time no data goes along with this HTTP request. And since there is no data, there is no way the web server, while executing dashboard.php, will have any information about the user's name and hence it will not be able to print it. To summarize, when a user clicks click here, it initiates a separate new request for dashboard.php. So the information from login_submit.php cannot be carried forward to dashboard.php because no information goes along with the request. In other words, there must be some information that must go along so that the web server can identify the user and fetch the corresponding information. Now, what this information is and how to pass it, This is something we will continue to explore in the next topic. See you soon. After going through this video, you will be able to explain cookies, apply set cookie to store cookies, explain the problem associated with cookies. In the previous video, we left on a cliffhanger that there must be some information that must go along with the HTTP request so that the web server can identify the user and fetch the information. In this video, we will discuss one of the ways to pass the information, and that is through cookies. If your mouth has started watering thinking about sweet and crunchy cookies, well, you are in a web development training, and here a cookie does not mean a piece of sweet. Let us first understand what a cookie is. A cookie is a small piece of information stored on the browser of a user by a website through some code. For example, when we view a product on some website and we start getting ads of the product or similar products on the same or other applications, this is all because of cookies. In PHP, we have a set cookie function that allows us to store cookies on the user's browser. The syntax is simple. Set cookie function followed by the key value pair as it stores the information in the key value form. And then another function, time, after which the cookie will expire. Here in the time function, if we see we have added the time in a certain format, this is a Unix timestamp, which is a way to track the time, and the numbers correspond to the seconds after which the cookie will expire. This means the time after which the cookie will expire will be 60 minutes or 3600 seconds. If you are interested to know more about Unix timestamp, you can click on the link given below the video and read about it. So whatever information we pass in this function, it is sent to the browser and is stored there in the form of a cookie. Next, cookies are website specific. This means if we open various websites like Intershala, Amazon, Netflix, YouTube, and so on in our browser, all these websites will store their cookies on our browser to store specific information. Let us take an example to understand this. An amazing sale is happening on this website. You have shortlisted several products and have added them to the cart. Now, as a second opinion, you want your friend to have a look before you buy. But as of now, your friend is busy with some other work, so you close the website and continue with some other work. Note that as you have opened this website on your browser, the website has stored cookies on your browser. For understanding purposes, let us name this cookie as X. And as soon as your friend came, you immediately opened the website and started showing the products. This may seem simple, but an interesting thing happened because of the cookie that is stored in your browser by the website. And that is, the items which you added in your cart were still there. This was possible because of cookie X, which the website stored in your browser. This cookie information, which denoted the products, was sent along with the HTTP request when you opened the website again. And Amazon used this information to fetch the products and show it in your cart. The cookie information is stored in the browser in the form of key value pairs. And every website stores their own set of information in the form of cookies. This information automatically goes along with every HTTP request we make for that website through that browser. For example, if you open YouTube, cookie information stored for YouTube will go along with that HTTP request. Similarly, if you open Facebook, cookie information stored for Facebook will go along with that HTTP request. But if you open a website, say XYZ, for the first time and whose cookie information is not stored on your browser, nothing will go with the request. But as you open the website might start storing some cookie information in your browser, and next time after that, when you open the website again, then the cookie information for this website will go along with this HTTP request. In PHP, we have a built-in super global variable $cookie that gets assigned with all the cookie related information that went along with the request. We can use this variable to fetch and use any of this information. So coming back to our problem, in the login_submit file, we are able to display the name because the email and password which the user entered was used to fetch the information from the database. But when the user click here, it initiates a new request for dashboard.php. This information from login_submit.php does not pass on to dashboard.php. Hence, dashboard.php doesn't know how to fetch the name. Then we discussed that some information must come along with the new HTTP request. so that dashboard.php should be able to identify the user and fetch information from his account. And to pass this information, cookies can be used. Pause the video for a moment and think how you can use the concept of cookies in order to achieve this. So, the moment we could identify the user in our login_submit.php, we should be able to store some user information onto the user's browser in the form of a cookie, so that next time when another HTTP request is being made, say for dashboard.php, that user information stored in the cookie is automatically fetched along. This information can be used inside the dashboard.php to identify the user and fetch relevant account information from our database. So in a login_submit.php, when we are matching the email and password successfully, we can store the user information in the form of a cookie on the user's browser. To add the cookie, we will use the setCookie function and will pass the key value pair along with the time functions. We are using the user_ID because this is unique and we can easily use it to identify a record. Now, once a record is identified, we can fetch any information related to that record. Though storing the information in the cookie is technically redundant, we are using it to make our dashboard code simple. Now, when the response goes back to the browser, this information we want to set as a cookie will go along with the response and will be stored on the user's browser. Then, when a user clicks on the click here, a new HTTP request for dashboard.php will be initiated. This time, the user information stored in the cookie will also go along. This information can be accessed inside the dashboard.php using the $cookie variable, and we can then use it to print the user's name. As interesting as the concept of cookies can get, but there is a problem with using cookies. As you know, cookies are stored on the user's browser and hence are accessible to them. So this allows them to edit this cookie information. So if a user replaces the user_ID which we have stored with someone else's user_ID, he can impersonate that person and critical information related to that person will be fetched and displayed on dashboard.php. But don't worry, in the real world, cookies alone are never used for login or for storing any critical data by any good website. They are used to store mainly non-critical information, where we are okay even if a user edits his cookies. Say for example, we wish to remember the last page which the user visited on our website. So the next time when the user opens our website, we can redirect the user to the last visited page. And in this case, we can store the user's last visited page on his browser as cookies. Even if the user edits the cookies, it will hardly affect anyone. This was all about cookies which are used to store non-critical information. In the next video, we will look at another way to store user information. After going through this video, you will be able to explain sessions, apply the concept of sessions in PHP. In the previous video, we discussed that to store non-critical information, we use cookies. And in this video, we will see how we can store critical information. Critical information can be anything like our password, bank account details, training progress, or anything similar that can cause serious damage to us if they are misused. As this information is crucial, this means it must be stored in a secure place. Now, in a communication channel, broadly we have a client and a server. We can't store critical information on the client side or the browser as it can be accessed by the user. However, when we talk about the servers, they are more secure because only the web server can access it using some code. This means we can store critical information on the server side. And here comes the concept of session into picture. Sessions are a small piece of information stored on the server, that is on the host computer, so that the web server through some code can access them but not the users. For example, let's say there are 4 users who are viewing a particular website. So for every user, the website creates a separate session that is user specific, and the data of that corresponding user is stored in their respective sessions. We can see for every individual user, the website has a separate user ID. Now, each session has a unique session ID through which these sessions can be accessed. It is these session IDs that are stored as cookies on the browser of each user. Suppose all these users have closed the website and they are no longer viewing it. So now, whenever one of these users visits the website again, the session ID which is stored as a cookie will go along with the HTTP request. That's how cookies work. And from the session ID, the host computer will fetch the corresponding session, and from that session, it will fetch the stored user ID, using which it can fetch other user related information from the database. Now you might think, if the session IDs are also stored on the browser of the user, how are they secure, as the user can still try to impersonate someone by editing the session ID stored in the cookie? Well, here in our example, the session IDs that we took are for understanding basis. In real life, the session IDs are actually very long alphanumeric strings, like for example this. So even if a user has access to his own session ID, the user won't be able to guess the session ID of another user. Next, we will look at how we can implement the concept of sessions in PHP. Similar to cookies, in PHP, we also have an inbuilt session start function for sessions. What happens when we call this function? It expects the browser to send a cookie with the name PHP-ID along with the HTTP request. And this PHP-ID contains a specific session ID. The function uses it to fetch the corresponding session and assigns whatever it contains to the $session superglobal variable. Using this $session variable, we can access information stored in the session like this. Now this was the case when the function was able to find the session ID. But there might be cases when it may fail to locate the PHP-ID. So let us look at such scenarios where it might happen. Firstly, it may be due to the fact that the user has visited the website for the first time. Hence, there is no cookie set on the user's browser for this website. Next, it may be because the user has deleted the cookie from the browser. Or it may be due to the reason that the user has edited the session ID stored in his cookie, which no longer matches with the session stored on the web server. Or the session stored on the server expired, or it has been deleted by the administrator. In such cases, when the session start function is not able to locate the PHP session ID cookie, for whichever mentioned reason, it will create a new session on the server and assign whatever it stores to the $session variable for it to be accessed by the PHP code. By default, this session is empty, and $session variable can be used to store any new information in the session. And as the response goes back, the corresponding session ID of the session is stored on the user's browser in the form of a cookie with the name PHP-ID. This also ensures that the next time when the user opens any web page on this website, a cookie with the name PHP-ID storing the session ID will definitely come along with the HTTP request. To summarize, session start function ensures to find a session corresponding to the user who is visiting the website and temporarily assigns it to the $session variable for us to access it. When session start function is called, $session is assigned and is ready to be used. If we try to use the $session variable without calling the session start function, it will throw an error. Note, for every request, $session stores different sessions based on the associated users. $session is like a temporary variable. The actual sessions are stored in the file system on the host computer. So now it's time to put our knowledge of sessions into practice by implementing it in the login_submit PHP file. At the top of the file, first we call the session start function because it should be present before any output in the file. This will create the session for the current user if it does not exist already, or it will fetch the existing one. Next, we will access this session using the $session variable. So inside the if condition, when the email and the password successfully matches, we will store the user ID and name inside this session like this. And this information gets stored in the session corresponding to that particular user, and this session is identified by the value of the cookie PHP-ID that comes along with the request. For another user, the PHP-ID value will be different. So when the email and password matches, this code will store the user_ID and the name in the session corresponding to that user. The session start function by itself sets a cookie with the name PHP-ID that stores the session ID in the form of a long alphanumeric string. This means we don't need cookies explicitly anymore. So we will comment out these lines from our code. And now coming to the dashboard.php file, We will call the session underscore start function like this. This will fetch the same session which was earlier created for this user. We can then simply check the user underscore ID it has stored to identify the user using the $session variable. So if we now click on the click here hyperlink, it will take us to the dashboard page which prints the message that we wanted. Now that here we were able to print the message because the email and password matched successfully. Note that here we were able to print the message because the email and password matched successfully. Now let us look at the scenario when the email or password fails to match. So to demonstrate, let me enter an incorrect password. In such a case, the session is created for the user due to the session start function at the top. But the session remains empty as it would not get into the if condition where the initialization takes place. This means even if the session is created for the user, it does not mean that the user is logged in. A user is considered to be logged in only if we are able to identify the user with respect to our database. That is, in our case, if the session has user underscore ID set and has a valid value. Can you guess what would happen if we try to open the dashboard.php file? You may pause the video and think for a moment. As you might have guessed, it will throw an error because we are trying to access user underscore ID inside the $session variable, which is not even set. This infers that it is not ideal to directly access any value inside the session, and as a good practice, we should always first see if there is some value set inside the $session variable. And for this we have the $isSet function. This function ensures that the session has a user ID set and is not equal to null. Only then it will try to print the name. So in our dashboard.php file, we can use this function like this. This function returns the value as true if the user is logged in. Otherwise, it returns false when the user is logged out. And lastly, we have a session destroy function. This function allows us to delete the data of any session. And the reason we use this function is to make the user log out from his account. To use this function, we will create a logout PHP file and will define the session start and session destroy function. Session destroy function deletes all the information we might have stored on the session, including the user underscore ID. So there is no way this user can then be identified the next time until the user logs in again. Can you tell why we have first defined the session start function and session destroy function later? This is because to destroy any session, we need to first fetch the session corresponding to that user, which is done by session start function. If we define the session destroy function first, the file will simply throw an error. That was all about PHP in this module. This module and particularly the last few topics are very crucial as you will be creating similar pages as part of your final project. So go through all the codes thoroughly, understand the logic, tweak the given codes by adding more information. All this will help you to become a good developer and be more confident. So up next is the quiz. All the best. Hi. In this video, we will discuss the solution of Module 5 assignment. In this assignment, you were given a task to complete a few things. To help you get started, pointers were given. We will start the first step, that is to convert all the existing HTML files to PHP files. To do this, what I have done is simply removed the .html extension and added the .php to all the files. This will convert all the HTML files to PHP. The next part was to change the linkings in our existing code. So in our index.php file, if you scroll, inside the page container, where you have major cities, you need to change the file linking. For example, for city Delhi, you need to change the link to property_list.php. Similarly, you can do the same for the rest of the cities. Make sure that all .html file linkings are changed to .php. Now, let us move to the next point of the problem statement. Here, you need to create a folder named includes in which you will place all the files with the common codes. For example, we have created a file header.php. I have taken the header code out from all the 4 files as it is common and have placed it in a new PHP file. The reason is simple. If in future I want to do any change in the header, there is only one place I need to make change instead of 4 different places. Similarly, from all the files, I have taken out the footer code and have placed it in a new file, footer.php. Apart from this, I have created another file, head_links.php. This file consists of all the common CSS files that are there in all the 4 web pages. Now, instead of adding separate CSS files into each PHP page, I have included one common PHP file, which is for CSS files, and one custom CSS file. Similarly, I have taken out the sign up modal code and the login modal code into separate PHP files as the code was common throughout all the PHP files. Again, I will emphasize, the codes that I have taken out, I have created a separate PHP file for each of them and have placed these files inside the includes folder. So let us go through the code of the index.php. In the head tag, we have included the head_links PHP file that contains the common CSS files. Notice here how we are including another PHP file in our code. We are using include to link another PHP file to the index.php file. After this, we have defined the path where the PHP file which we want to link is present. Next, inside the body tag, you can see I have included the header.php file for the header part of the web application. Similarly, at the end of the code, I have included signupmodal.php, loginmodal.php, and footer.php. The same thing that we did in the index.php file is applicable to the remaining files, that is propertylist.php, propertydetail.php. You need to take the common code out and instead include the link of the PHP file there. But things are a little different in case of the dashboard.php file. Here, we don't have to link the signupmodal.php and loginmodal.php. Can you guess why? This is because a user can only access the dashboard page once the user is logged in. So there is no need to show the sign up or login option. So we will only link the footer.php here. Also, if you notice that the header of the dashboard.php file is different to that of the other files. This is because here the user is logged in. So there has to be an if condition in the header.php file. Here, if you see, we have added an if condition, a PHP code. Here we are checking if the person is not logged in. You can see the operator here, then show the modal part. Else, it will show hi and then the username followed by a link to the dashboard and a logout button. You can find this code in the problem statement. With this, we have completed the first 2 points. Now, let us proceed to the third point. Again, create a footer.php file. This we have already discussed how to do. Apart from this, your task was to change the property_list.html to the property_list.php, followed by a question mark, city equal to name of the city. For example, for Delhi, you can see that this link will now only fetch the properties that are related to Delhi. Similarly, The same things need to be done for the remaining cities. Moving on, head_links.php. This we have already covered earlier in this video. Next, we have signup_modal. You already know the code. In this, one more thing was there that you needed to add the method and action attribute. You already know to submit a form, we use method and action attributes. So in our signup_modal.php, we have added these attributes where we have the form. Notice here that the request is post. If you look at the index.php code, where we have the form, we have the request as get because it is a search type. Coming back to our post request type, we will understand why we have named the folder as API in the next module assignment. This is the only change in the signup modal code that you need to make. Similarly, in the login modal.php code, you need to add the form attributes where action equal to login_submit.php. Now let us discuss the next file, database_connect.php. If you see, for all the web pages and even for login and sign up files, we need to fetch data from the database, and for that, we need to connect to the database. So in this file, we will write the PHP code that will allow us to connect to the database. In this file, we have used two different code snippets. MySQLi_connect helps to connect to the database, and then we have MySQLi_connect_error. That will display the error message in case the connection fails to establish. Note that here you need to use your own password between the inverted commas. So this code is common and you're going to need it everywhere. This is the reason I have kept it inside the includes folder. Well, that's it for this video. We will continue to discuss the solution of the remaining things in the next video. Hi, welcome back. Let us continue our discussion on the solution of Module 5 assignment. So the next task was to create an API folder inside which you had to create two post submit files. As I have mentioned in the previous video, in the next assignment, we will discuss why we have named this folder as API. So please don't worry at this moment. The reason we have created signup_submit.php and login_submit.php is to make the signup and login modal work. Let us start with signup_submit.php file. The code was already provided to you to help you get started with the assignment. Let us discuss it. Here you can see we have used this code snippet. This is used to establish the connection to the database. Also notice, here I have used require, which is a statement. Earlier we used include to link the PHP files. Include and require both are almost the same, and the minute difference between them is not important to discuss at this point. Next, we are fetching the user information using the post superglobal variable and are storing them in the local variables. But notice, for the password, we are not storing the password as such in the database, because if we do, then anyone who is working on the code will know your password. Therefore, it is not ethical for a developer to store the user password in the database normally. So what we have done here, first, we have fetched the password and then we have encrypted it using the SHA1 function. After encrypting, we are then sorting the password in the next database. Next, we are checking if the email matches from the users table or not. Then we are checking if the results has more than one row or not. If the row count is 0, this means that the user is not registered. And if the row count is not 0, this means the user is registered with the website. This code is basically to check that before we add the data to the database, we are checking if the user is registered or not. Now, if the row count is 0, then only we will proceed next where we will store the user information. Then we have this small MySQLi query that checks if the account is successfully created or not. Then we have an anchor tag for the home page. This is fairly simple code, we have already learned it. Next, we will discuss the login_submit.php code. Here, we need the session start function. Then we have this line to establish the connection to the database. The remaining code is something similar to what we have discussed in the signup_submit.php, so I will skip the remaining part. Please go through it. Next, we will move to the code of logout.php. This was a simple code and the file was already given to you as a starting point. Here, the first line will help to identify the session. And then using the next line of code, we can destroy the session. And then using the third line, we are directing the user to the home page again. This time the user will be logged out. After this, let us move to the next part of the assignment. Here in the city search form, your task was to add action and method. Let us go through the code. Here you can see we have added the method as get and action as property_list.php. The next part is to change all the HTML to PHP files. This we have already discussed earlier in the video. Now let us move to the property list.php where we have to fetch the data from the database. Here we have a session start function because we want to check if the user is logged in or not. Then we have this line of code to connect to the database. Now if the user is logged in, we will get his user_ID using the $_session. Next, the city name will be fetched from the URL using this line of code. Then in the next line, we are checking whether the city entered by the user is valid or not. We are checking the name entered by cross-referring to the cities table. After this, we have similar things. Like if the user enters an incorrect city name, we are printing the message, we do not have PG listed in this city. And if the city is present, we are fetching city_ID. And then using the city_ID, we are fetching the properties of that particular city. After this, we are storing all the properties in the properties array. Then we have this part of the code that will fetch properties that have been marked as interested by user. Next, we are using the properties array to fetch the number of properties for a particular city using the for each loop. If you remember in module 2 and 3 assignment, we had hard-coded this entire property list page. But now, as we have stored the data in the database, we are directly fetching from there for a particular property. And this glob is used to fetch the images from the database for the particular property. Then we have used the loop for the star rating. Please spend some time understanding this code. If you can understand this code, you will be able to understand the code and logic for the rest of the PHP files. With this, we have come to the end of another exciting video. Up next is a module test. All the best.